very much, John, and good morning, everyone. I was slightly thrown there by staring at a flashing Christmas tree on 28th of November. I do find that quite hard to stomach. Having said that, now I'm looking at all you wonderful people. I'll find it slightly easier, I think, rather than staring at it. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here this morning, and thank you very much, John, for inviting me to address you. As John rightly says, social mobility and widening access is a really key part of Universities UK's strategic priorities, and in the new funding and regulatory landscape, it will absolutely remain central to everything that we do. And indeed, I'm really pleased that you'll be hearing from Alan Milburn later this afternoon. We've just submitted evidence to Alan Milburn's review, and it is very helpful, I think, that I can use this opportunity to map out a few issues that we know will be informing how he's approaching the issue of social mobility in higher education. I certainly don't need to remind all of you that we're going to be facing some unprecedented changes in the way that higher education is funded and organised. And I'm going to be touching on some of those changes in my presentation this morning. And in particular, I will be looking at the impact of student choice on widening participation. And of course, that's not just the choice whether or not to go to university, but also increasingly the choice as to which university to go to and how to study, and the implications that that may have for widening participation. And I'm also going to be looking at and touching on the impact of the reforms to student number controls, which again could have quite profound implications for widening participation and how we need to react to it. And I think it's fair to say that UK, we welcome these changes for various reasons, but we are very concerned about the pressures that they create in our efforts to broaden the social mix in higher education. I'm also going to touch on some of the changes that we are seeing in relation to both admissions and also the UCAS reforms for changes to the admissions process throughout the UK. We know that schools are themselves also going through their fair share of reforms, such as changes to the curriculum and the way that advice and guidance is issued. And again, that clearly is going to have impact on social mobility. But before moving on to those pressures and those challenges, there's three, I think, quite fundamental considerations that I think need to provide the context for these discussions. And the first one is that it could well have been that this government, the coalition government, would have focused on the need to introduce a market, the need to deregularise, and to have said nothing about social mobility. And I think what is absolutely clear from what's emerging, and as you'll hear indeed from this afternoon, is that that is absolutely not the case. We do not get any impression at all that the government is losing interest in the issue of widening participation and social mobility. And indeed, on the contrary, we are very aware of the real focus that they've got on how universities can widen social mobility and encourage access from wider groups in society to go to universities. And although clearly the reforms do raise issues as to how we go about achieving that, I think that the attention and the concern and the priority that social mobility has amongst this government is really something to be welcomed. But not only that, it's an attention and an interest that I think we in the sector need to harness in a constructive and positive way to ensure that it's informing and supporting how we go forward on this agenda. And clearly, we've got a tremendous record within higher education in terms of widening access. The recent HEFCE statistics show slow but nonetheless significant higher participation in lower socioeconomic groups. And we've seen this huge expansion of student numbers, which undoubtedly has assisted and supported widening participation. So it's not as if we're starting either from a low base or a level base. We're starting with a degree of momentum. And I think we need to build on that and ensure that we don't lose sight amongst the general fiscal gloom of the fact that it is a slow and painful but nonetheless positive picture that we're working from. So how can we harness that with the government's commitment to this agenda to take these issues forward in a constructive way? The second fact that I wanted to flag, the contextual issue, is the reality that whatever else one might think about the higher education white paper, students at the heart of the system, and to some extent we simply don't know what the implications of the white paper proposals are going to be. But despite that, overall, the new funding system has brought in, or is bringing in, overall more money into the higher education sector than was previously the case. And that is quite extraordinary, given the eye-watering reductions that are taking place in other sectors. And indeed, it's interesting talking to counterparts, particularly in other European countries, where they are desperately worried about the dramatic cuts that they're seeing to their publicly funded higher education budget and the attrition on many initiatives that they've undertaken, not least their equivalent attempts to widen participation and increase access. Now, that's clearly there's a limit to how far you can push the parallels between what's happening in this country and abroad, but nonetheless, the position remains that under the new student fee system, there is overall more money coming into the system, and that's something that we mustn't lose sight of. Of course, the issue is it's not being evenly distributed, and that could in itself have impact on social mobility, but nonetheless, I do think that's an issue that we have to keep in mind as we approach this agenda. The alternative, of course, would have been what we saw in the 80s and 90s, which was a reduction in income coming into the system. And the impact that that had on widening participation is something that you were would all be aware of. And indeed, all students suffered the consequences of that, particularly those coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. And as part of that, of course, we do see as part of these reforms funding for the first time for part-time students to have access to loans, and that really does have quite significant implications in terms of social mobility. And again, I think it's something that we must not lose sight of. And the third area that I wanted to flag is the fact that we are moving in a very fast-changing environment, and I think however you look at it, that is causing us real concerns, and I want to come on to that in terms of how we can approach issues of the impact of funding. But nonetheless, I think that the speed of change and the uncertainty about the outcomes mustn't lead us to make assumptions about what the impact of these changes will be. I mean, the reality is we really don't know. And clearly that's a good thing and a bad thing, but what I think it does mean is that it's incumbent on all of us not to leap to conclusions about the doom and gloom of the consequences of this environment, because we simply don't know. And I think given the 2 points that I mentioned before, the commitment to social mobility and overall the increased funding, and the fact that we have a very proud history of widening participation, there is a lot to be positive about here. And so it's against that background that I want to now turn to what are undoubted challenges that we're all facing in terms of social mobility and widening participation. And there are three challenges in particular that I wanted to flag. One is the implications of student choice, of greater student choice on social mobility. The second, as I said, is student number controls. And third, the flip side of the uncertainty is, of course, uncertainty and the speed of change and how that in turn is impacting on students. So, moving first of all to student choice. The proposed new funding arrangements for 12-13 will encourage and prioritise the role of student choice in the new system. And it is students and their decisions as to where to go and what to study that will be a much more significant driver of the allocation of teaching funding than has been the case in the past. Of course, the major challenge remains persuading potential students to go to university, particularly those who do not come from a background where they would automatically have assumed that they would go. And our real concern in the sector in the UK is how do we ensure that those borderline applicants, in other words, those who may or may not go to university from non-traditional backgrounds, do make the right decision for them, and that concerns about funding do not prevent them from realising their genuine and legitimate aspirations. And this raises a major issue in terms of communicating the package of fees, loans, bursaries and grants, which actually taken together should ensure that no one should be put off from going to university. I've been on many a platform and done many media interviews where I've been attempting to explain the package, and it is mighty complicated. And that's a real problem, that even though one knows that adding it all up, it's actually not a bad package, and indeed if you're poorer, you're better off, that you're actually paying less money per month, albeit over a longer period, which means that you have a greater likelihood of accessing a mortgage. I mean, one might know all that, but explaining it in a way that's very clear and coherent is incredibly difficult, and I think this raises huge communication challenges, particularly for people who don't have the support of a well-experienced admissions machine in their schools that many independent schools do provide. And it's not just a question of students understanding it, of course, it's a question of their families understanding it. Surveys carried out by UK indicate that increasingly family members are playing a very important part in making that collective decision as to whether or not an individual should go to university. And the media, driven by the political dimensions of all of this, don't help. There is a discourse of, quote, debt hanging around students' neck, which is very far from the truth. The system does, in fact, resemble more of a graduate tax than a loan debt. And as Nick Barr, who is a specialist who many of you will know, who leads on this area as one of his academic areas at the London School of Economics, as he frequently says, parents do not lie awake at night worrying about their sons or daughters paying higher rates of income tax if they earn a lot of money in the future. And there is an analogy there that if you don't worry about your son or daughter paying higher rates of income tax, then why should one be concerned about paying higher rates of loan repayments? It's not an exact analogy, but I think it's an indication of the fact that the vocabulary of debt hanging around people's neck is way wide of the mark and could be having very damaging impact. So it's really critical that we develop a more sophisticated and accurate way of communicating these changes to the funding regime, to ensure that people do understand. And of course they may well decide that university is not for them, and that's obviously completely right and completely necessary, but as long as they're making the right decision for them, that's really all that matters. And across the country, we know that many of you in universities are working very hard with schools and representative bodies to ensure that young people are not put off by misinformation of this sort. We at Universities UK have been very involved in the campaign with the independent task force on student finance information, which many of you will know is led by Martin Lewis, a money saving expert. And what's great about working with Martin is that he thinks in terms of how messages are heard by young people in their family, whereas I think at Universities UK we're so embedded in the system that we tend to see things from an institutional perspective and therefore sometimes maybe not as effective at communicating as a consumer champion like Martin is. And I think that a lot of what he's been saying is at last having some impact. And many of you may have seen some of the materials that we've been working with Martin to produce. With the strap line, you can afford to go to university. And we've just secured funding from Santander to send copies of guides to every single school in the country, which sets these messages out. And I think that's a tremendous achievement. And if any of you are interested in seeing some of these materials, then do contact UK. We can provide you with copies on them. And they can all be downloaded as well from the task force website. And part of the resources that are available, and these are proving incredibly helpful in communicating with young people. There's a repayments calculator, and there's a code available which enables young people and their families to embed the calculator It can be embedded on websites, and you can play around with variables as to tuition fees and maintenance loans and see what differences different loan levels and bursary levels make on how much you have to pay and so on and so forth, and that's proving very popular. And there's radio clips and videos that you can draw on, either in terms of presentations or embed them in your own websites. And then there's the guides, as I mentioned before, that we've put together, which are both pitched at teachers and indeed students, and they can be cut and pasted onto websites and used. And all sorts of newsletters and magazines, all available on the Task Force website. So if you're not plugged into that, do please access it and see whether any of it can support the work that you're doing. And indeed, if there's anything else you think we should be doing, either the Independent Task Force or indeed at UK, because you think there's a gap in that communications exercise, then please let us know, because we're very aware that this is a programme that can't just stop now that we're getting the first signs of UCAS figures in, and it's a programme that's going to have to continue right the way through the year. And then, of course, we've got 13-14 to worry about as well. So this is an ongoing programme, and if you have ideas as to what we should be doing too, please let me know. And we had Student Finance Day on 14th of November, where we were attempting to bring all the agencies together. As John said, collaboration is so much key to all of this. And I think it was reasonably successful, but again, your experience of that was very helpful. It's something that universities themselves took away and ran with, some of them. And I think our feedback is that where it was done, it had real impact locally. So I think that was very successful. But as I say, this process can't stop. And I think the focus on communicating the reality of tuition fees and what's available is absolutely critical. And we haven't won that battle yet, and I think we will need to, all of us, to focus on how we can take that agenda forward in the future. The point about all of this, of course, is not just that we're encouraging people to go to university if it's appropriate for them, so that they're not put off by misinformation, but also encouraging them to think in a very informed way about what university they should go to, what course is right for them, whether it's right for them to do distance learning, part-time, full-time, all that myriad of decisions, which of course you'll be well familiar with dealing with. But nonetheless, it's heightened because we have variable fees, because we've got different packages on offer. And I think working out what the implications of that variable choice will be on students is really critical. At UK, we instructed a report from Professor Jeff Crossick. Some of you may know him now, Vice-Chancellor of the University of London, called The Future is Not Just Tomorrow. It's a tremendous title, actually. And one of the concerns expressed in that report was that, yes, we may maintain attendance of students at university, and that's tremendous, but actually increasingly what matters is what decisions they make and what sort of higher education experience they offer. And I think what we've got to be really careful about is that the impact of all these myriad of choices, combined with the student funding regime, doesn't lead to a situation, this is Jeff Crossick's analysis, whereby the 18 to 21-year-old campus experience is the domain of the middle classes, and distance part-time learning is the domain of students from disadvantaged backgrounds because it's cheaper. That would be, I think, very worrying. So I think looking into the future, we've got to be really careful that it's not just a question of encouraging students to go to university, but a more sophisticated analysis of what choices they're making to make sure that those decisions reflect their particular priorities and interests rather than their socio-economic background. Moving on now to the second challenge, which is student number controls. And there's been so much debate about AAB and the implications of that I can barely bring myself to add to it. But having said that, this is really important, and I think we all need to be talking about it and thinking through what the implications are of the government's proposals to deregulate AAB grades in 2012. What this means is that universities will be incentivized to recruit and expand numbers of students who have AAB A-level grades or equivalents, in the sense that student number controls won't apply to that group, and therefore they can recruit as many students as they like with all the attracted funding that goes with them. And what we're finding is that institutions, probably many of yours, are offering quite significant financial incentives to AAB students as part of that package. UUK supported the deregulation of numbers. We think that is a good thing which sits alongside the deregulation of